Elias Morin swung the hammer again, and another stone broke loose from the fireplace his family needed to survive. Cold air slid through the cabin like a knife. His hands were raw from clay and frost. Behind him, his two boys sat wrapped in quilts near the table, watching in silence while snow hissed against the walls. Outside the window, riders slowed their horses to stare at the fool tearing apart his own hearth in the middle of a Montana winter. He did not stop. The fire had already died. The old stone opening sat broken at his boots. Mud, soot, and loose rock covered the floorboards. Elias knelt and set another brick of clay into place with careful hands, as if the storm outside had no claim on him at all. But every few moments he glanced at the boys, and each glance landed in his chest like weight. If he was wrong, the cold would punish all of them before morning. If he was right, it would change everything. The Bitter Elk Valley had no patience for strange ideas. By March of 1885, the land had already taught that lesson to plenty of men. It had humbled farmers from Missouri, dreamers from Ohio, and carpenters from the East who thought a fine house was enough to tame mountain cold. Winter out there did not care how proud a man was. It cared whether his walls held, whether his woodpile lasted, and whether his fire could still answer when night dropped hard across the valley. Most folks built the same way. Log walls, stone chimney, wide fireplace, big flames, big smoke, big piles of cut wood disappearing into the mouth of winter. Elias had built that way too when he first arrived. Now he was tearing it apart. At the rough table near the window, his wife, Anna, tucked another blanket around the shoulders of their sons. Benji, the older one, was 9 and trying hard not to complain. Little Caleb was 6 and kept rubbing his hands together under the quilt. Anna had set a small cook flame in an iron pot near the door, and that weak heat was all that stood between the family and a frozen wash basin. For 3 days, she had watched her husband break down the only thing in the cabin most people trusted. Still, she had not asked him to stop. "You should rest your hands," she said softly. Elias pressed wet clay into the narrow wall he was shaping and shook his head. Not yet. Benji looked from his mother to the little structure rising where the fireplace had been. "Pa," he said, "will it really warm the whole room?" Elias turned then. His face looked older in the gray light, drawn from too many nights of cutting wood and too many mornings waking to cold boards under his boots. But his voice stayed calm. "It will," he said, "if I build it right." Caleb frowned at the tiny opening. "But it's so small." A weak smile touched Elias's mouth. "That's the point." Outside, the wind lifted snow off the valley floor and swept it past the cabin in long white ribbons. The mountains beyond the trees had vanished into a wall of cloud. Every now and then a gust hit the house so hard the logs groaned. The boys flinched at the sound. Anna looked toward the door, then back at her husband. He knew that look. It was not doubt in him. It was fear of the weather, fear of time, fear of what happened to families who ran out of both heat and luck at once. He crossed the room, crouched beside the boys, and pulled the quilt higher around Caleb's shoulders. Just a little longer. Anna watched him in silence. There was trust in her eyes, but not blind trust. It was the harder kind. The kind that stands beside a person when the whole valley says he has lost his senses. Before coming to Montana, Elias had spent nearly 15 years in northern villages across Russia building clay heating stoves. Not open fireplaces, not roaring wall fires that threw warmth in one direction and sent the rest up the chimney. What he knew were sealed heaters made to hold heat, guide it, and store it deep in thick walls of clay and brick. A short fire in the morning could warm a house long after the flame had vanished. When he first settled in America the year before, he tried living the local way. He cut timber, raised the cabin, stacked fieldstone, and built a fireplace like every other man around him. It looked strong. It burned bright. For a few weeks, he told himself it might be enough. Then December came. The flames ate wood like hunger without end. Stand close and your face felt scorched. Step back a few feet, and the room turned cruel again. By dawn, the warmth was always gone. Frost crept inside the door. Water skimmed over with ice. The boys slept huddled near the hearth because the far side of the cabin might as well have been outside. By January, Elias was spending half his life with an axe in his hands. Each evening the fire roared. Each morning the cabin felt defeated again. The fireplace was not saving them, it was draining them. So in the last week of February, after one long night of feeding logs into a fire that still could not hold the cold back, Elias made his choice. He would stop fighting winter the wrong way. He would build the kind of system he trusted, even if the valley laughed, even if the work had to be done with snow driving against the walls and his boys wrapped in blankets behind him. That afternoon, the first visitor came. A rider pulled up outside, boots crunching in the drift. A moment later, a knock hit the doorframe. Anna opened it a crack, and a gust of white air pushed inside with Wade Harlan from the next property over. He stamped snow from his boots and peered across the room. His eyes landed on the strange little shape rising from the floor. For a second, he said nothing. Then he laughed. "Morin," he said. "I heard you'd gone and smashed your fireplace, but I didn't believe it." He stepped closer, staring at the tiny firebox opening Elias had formed. "Lord above, that thing's smaller than my bread oven." Elias went on smoothing the clay seam with a wooden tool. "It doesn't need to be big." Wade folded his arms. "Doesn't need to be big?" He gave a short laugh toward Anna, as if asking her to join him in common sense. "Your family planning to crowd around that little hole and pray for summer?" Anna did not answer. Wade looked back at Elias. "You tore out a sound hearth in March for a mud stove fit for a child's dollhouse." Elias rose slowly to his feet. Clay stained his fingers and wrists. "A big fire is not the same as a useful one." Wade snorted. "Tell that to the storm coming." For the first time, Elias's eyes hardened. "I am." The room went quiet except for the whisper of wind outside and the small pop from the cook flame near the door. Wade glanced at the boys, then at Anna, then back at the half-finished heater with its narrow firebox and the long clay bench Elias was shaping along the wall. It looked ridiculous. He was right about that. A little upright chamber, a buried pipe path running through packed clay and earth, a bench instead of a roaring hearth. To any man in the valley, it looked less like survival and more like surrender. Wade shook his head and backed toward the door. "When that thing fails, don't let pride keep you from borrowing wood." He stepped outside and the cold rushed in around him. Anna shut the door fast. For a while, nobody spoke. Then Caleb asked in a small voice, "Pa, what if he's right?" Elias looked at the unfinished bench, at the thin firebox, at the clay path that would have to carry every hope in the house before the real cold arrived. Then he looked at his sons. "The storm will tell us," he said. And by the next morning, the wind over Bitter Elk Valley had begun to change. By dawn, the whole valley felt different. The wind no longer came in restless bursts. It blew with purpose now, hard and steady, sweeping down from the high country and driving thin snow across the land like white smoke. The sky turned flat and gray. It hung low over Bitter Elk Valley, heavy as iron. Men stepping out to their woodpiles stopped and looked north with the same thought rising in all of them at once. Bad weather was coming. At the trading post in Pine Crossing, the thermometer showed 8 below by sunrise. No one liked the number, but no one panicked either. Montana winters had sharp teeth. Folks there were used to pain. They hauled feed, split wood, and checked on stock with stiff fingers and frozen mustaches, telling each other it had been worse before. By the next morning, the cold had dropped harder. By the third, it became something the valley would remember for years. The temperature fell to numbers that made doors freeze to their frames. Wind hammered the cabins without rest. Snow raced sideways across the ground so fast it looked off. Men shouted to each other from 10 feet away and still had trouble hearing. Every chimney in the valley poured smoke as families fed their fireplaces day and night. And still the cold kept pressing inward through log walls, window seams, and under doors. At Wade Harlan's place, the fire never stopped roaring. His oldest hired hand slept in his boots and woke every hour to add more wood. Even then, the cabin stayed bitter at the edges. His youngest girl slept by the hearth under 2 buffalo robes, and the water bucket beside the wall carried a skin of ice each morning. Across the valley, Tom Garner fought the same battle. His fireplace blazed so hard the stones glowed, but the far end of the room stayed cold enough to bite. He burned through half his dry stack in 3 days and then started dragging green timber from the tree line just to keep the flames alive. At the blacksmith shop in Pine Crossing, Owen Pike cursed at his iron stove while feeding it log after log. The room never held warmth for long. The heat rose, vanished, and left the floorboards cold again. He knew fire better than most men. That week, even he looked beaten by it. Everywhere in Bitter Elk Valley, the same struggle played out. More wood, bigger flames, more labor, less reward. Men chopped until their shoulders shook. Women stuffed blankets against cracks and door frames. Children slept in coats and hats. The cold seemed to find every weakness and widen it. But at the south end of the valley, on the Morin place, something different was happening. Smoke still rose from the cabin, but only in a thin ribbon. No black cloud, no roaring chimney. Just a faint thread fading into the storm. On the morning of March 14th, Wade Harlan rode past on his way to cut more timber. His beard was stiff with ice, and his horse snorted white into the wind. As he passed Elias Morin's property, he glanced toward the cabin and frowned. There was hardly any smoke. His hands tightened on the reins. In weather like this, a chimney ought to be working like a furnace. If it was not, that meant one of 2 things. Either Elias had built a miracle, or the fire had gone out, and the family inside was freezing. Wade rode on another 100 yards. Then he stopped. The image would not leave him. Anna in that cabin, the 2 boys, the fool husband with his clay bench and little firebox. Wade muttered under his breath, turned the horse and headed back through the blowing snow. The wind hit him hard as he crossed the Morin yard. He tied the horse to the post and bent his head against the cold while he climbed the steps. His knuckles rapped on the door. It opened almost at once. Anna stood there in the warm light. She wore a plain house dress, no heavy coat, no shawl pulled tight around her shoulders, no gloves. Her hair was pinned back loosely, and her cheeks held color. For one long second, Wade only stared. Warm air rolled out around her and wrapped itself over his frozen face. Not sharp heat. Not that wild blast you get standing too near an open fire. This was softer, even, deep. "Wade," Anna said gently, "come in before you freeze on the step." He stepped through the doorway without a word. The door shut behind him, and there he stopped. The warmth inside the cabin caught him so fully he forgot to take off his gloves. It did not sit in one corner of the room the way fireplace heat did. It filled the place. Near the door, by the table, along the far wall, the air felt nearly the same. Lamplight glowed across the room. The boards were dry. No frost touched the inside of the door. At the table, Benji and Caleb were building a little fort from carved wood blocks. Both boys wore only thin shirts. No coats, no hats, no quilts wrapped around their shoulders. Their faces looked calm and easy, as if the world outside was not trying to kill a man 3 steps from the porch. On the long clay bench against the wall, Elias sat repairing a harness strap with steady hands. He looked up. Cold day. Wade let out a slow breath. "How warm is it in here?" Elias nodded toward a small thermometer hanging on the north wall. "About 60. Wade crossed the room and stared at it. The glass told the truth plain enough. The room was warmer than his own cabin had been all week, and his fireplace had been devouring wood like a starving animal. He turned slowly toward the little heater. A single split log burned inside the narrow opening. That was all. One piece. One calm, upright flame. No roar. No shower of sparks. No frantic mouth of fire chewing through a pile of timber. Just a steady burn climbing where Elias had forced it to go. "How much wood today?" Wade asked. Elias thought a moment. 3 pieces since morning. Maybe 4 by night." Wade stared at him as if he had spoken in another language. "That's all?" "I feed it when the bench cools," Elias said. "Every few hours." Wade walked to the clay bench and laid a hand on it. Warmth met his palm at once. Not burning heat like iron. Not weak heat that faded when you reached for it. This warmth felt stored. It sat in the clay the way sunlight sits in stone at the end of a long day. He moved his hand farther down the bench. Still warm. All the way along. He sat slowly, and the heat rose through his coat into his back and bones. For a moment, he said nothing at all. The storm hissed outside. The boys kept stacking blocks. Anna moved near the table, slicing bread, as if such warmth in such weather were the most ordinary thing on earth. Finally, Wade looked at Elias. "I laughed at you." Elias kept working on the harness. "You were not the only one. I thought you'd gone mad." A small smile touched Elias's face. "Maybe I did, but not about the stove." Wade gave a breath that almost sounded like a laugh, though shame sat under it. He looked around the room once more, at the dry walls, at the boys in shirt sleeves, at Anna standing without fear in a warm house while the valley froze. Then his expression changed. He was not laughing anymore. "Elias," he said quietly, "I think I owe you an apology." Elias set down the leather strap. "No. What matters is whether you understand it now." Wade looked at the heater again. "I understand one thing. I've burned through near half my stack in 4 days, and my girl still sleeps in her boots." A shadow crossed Anna's face at that. She knew what those words meant. Every mother in the valley would know. Wade rubbed his jaw, then asked the question he had fought not to ask since stepping through the door. "Can you show me?" Elias looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded. That evening, while the storm still tore across Bitter Elk Valley, Wade Harlan stayed in the Morin cabin for 2 hours. Elias showed him the narrow firebox that forced the flame upward. He explained how the heat traveled through the buried path under the bench. He spoke of keeping the fire hot and clean instead of big and wasteful. Wade listened harder than he had listened to anything in years. By the next morning, he was already telling others what he had seen. Most men did not believe him, but one man did not laugh. That man was Owen Pike, the blacksmith in Pine Crossing, and before the storm had fully passed, he was already riding toward Elias Morin's cabin with 2 thermometers in his saddlebag. By the time Owen Pike reached the Morin cabin, the storm had not loosened its grip. The wind still tore across Bitter Elk Valley with a sound like something alive and angry. Snow scraped over the ground in long white streaks. The cold had settled so deep into the land that even the trees looked brittle. Owen tied his horse outside and stepped onto the porch with 2 thermometers in his coat pocket. He was not a man easily fooled. He had spent 11 years working iron, fixing stoveplates, patching chimneys, and listening to men swear their heating troubles came from bad luck instead of bad design. He knew what most fireplaces could do. He also knew what they could not do. So when Wade Harlan told him a cabin on the south end of the valley was holding close to 60 degrees on a few small logs, Owen did not laugh. He wanted proof. Anna opened the door, and warm air rolled over him before he even crossed the threshold. That alone made him narrow his eyes. He stepped inside and let the door close behind him. The warmth was real, not just near the little clay heater, not just beside the bench. It held across the whole room. Elias stood from the table and greeted him with quiet politeness. The boys sat near the lamplight, calm and comfortable, with no coats on their backs. Outside, children in other cabins were sleeping wrapped in hides near roaring hearths. Inside this one, the air felt settled and safe. Owen said very little at first. He took 1 thermometer from his pocket and hung it on the far north wall. The second he placed near the door, where cold usually found its way in no matter how hard a family fought it. Then he stood in silence and watched the room. 30 minutes later, he checked both instruments. 58 by the far wall, 56 near the door. He stared at the numbers. The difference was so small it almost offended him. A normal fireplace left one side of a cabin warm and the rest half surrendered to cold. This place held heat like a closed hand. Owen turned toward the firebox. A single split log burned inside. The flame rose straight and narrow through the little chamber, bright but quiet. No waste. No wild licking blaze. The smoke was burning clean, just as Elias had claimed. Without a word, Owen stepped back outside and walked to the pipe where the exhaust left the cabin. He held his hand near it and frowned. The air coming out was barely warm. That stopped him more than anything. A normal chimney carried a house's comfort up into the sky. That was the frontier way. Men fed giant fireplaces, and those fireplaces fed winter. But this little system gave almost nothing back to the cold. It kept the heat where it belonged. Owen went back inside and removed his gloves slowly. "I've spent half my life building stoves that waste wood," he said at last. Elias said nothing. Owen looked at the bench, then the firebox, then the room as a whole. "Show me how you built it." So Elias did. He explained the narrow chamber that forced the flame upward. He explained the insulated rise that let the fire burn hotter and cleaner. He explained the long path under the earthen bench, where heat moved slowly through clay and packed earth before leaving the house. He spoke simply, with no pride in his voice, only certainty. This was not a trick. It was not magic. It was just fire given a better road. Owen pulled a notebook from his coat and wrote down every part of it. The measurements, the materials, the shape of the burn chamber, the bench length, the way the heat stored itself in the clay and let go slowly over time. When he finished, he looked up and asked, "How many logs in a full day?" "4 usually," Elias said. "Sometimes less." Owen let out a breath through his nose and gave a small shake of his head. "My stove burns 6 times that." Elias's mouth moved into a faint smile. "Then your stove is hungry." That made Owen laugh. It was the first easy sound in the room. News traveled fast after that. By the next morning, men were talking about the Morin heater at the trading post, at the blacksmith shop, outside the livery, and beside half-empty wood piles all over Bitter Elk Valley. Some still doubted it. Frontier men do not give up old beliefs quickly, especially not in winter. But doubt weakens when firewood runs low. The first man to ask Elias for help was Wade Harlan. He came without laughter this time. Snow still lined the fence posts when he stood in the Morin yard with his hat in both hands. His face looked worn down from hard cold and harder thinking. "My wood won't carry us much longer," he said. "If you'll help me, I want to build one." Elias nodded as if the answer had already been waiting. He sketched the layout on the back of a feed sack. Wade followed the plan as best he could with salvaged brick, stovepipe, clay, and packed earth from the edge of his own place. It was rough work, not pretty, not exact. But by the next cold night, the little heater in Wade's cabin was doing what his big fireplace never had. The room held warmth, not blazing heat near the flames and misery everywhere else. Real warmth, spread out, steady, lasting. His daughter slept without boots for the first time in days. That was all the proof he needed. Then came Tom Garner, who had laughed loudest at the idea. After him came 2 brothers from the North Slope, then a widow with a drafty cabin near the creek, then a trapper who had nearly burned through his winter stock before March was half done. Owen Pike began helping with better pipe fitting and stronger stove doors. The strange little firebox that once looked like a joke started appearing in cabin after cabin. By the next winter, more than a dozen homes in Bitter Elk Valley had some version of Elias Morin's heater inside them. Families who used to burn through a mountain of wood now used a fraction of it. Children who once slept in coats now slept under blankets like children ought to. Rooms that had always known hot corners and frozen floors learned what even warmth felt like. No one called it foolish anymore. And Elias never once claimed he had invented a miracle. When people asked where the design came from, he always answered the same way. "This is how I learned to heat a home. The fire can do more than people think if you stop wasting its strength." He lived quietly after that. He raised his boys. He helped neighbors shape their heaters. He asked little for himself. When folks tried to praise him too much, he usually changed the subject and went back to work. But the valley remembered. Years later, long after that terrible March had passed into local memory, men still spoke of the winter when giant fireplaces failed and one little firebox kept a family warm. Elias Morin died in 1921 at 77 years old. By then, his sons were grown men, and the cabin had weathered decades of wind, snow, and sun. Not long after, Neighbors who helped take the old place down found something they talked about for years. The earthen bench inside had never cracked. After all that time, it was still dry, still solid, still holding the path of heat he had once taught fire to follow. But the story was never only about a stove. It was about the mistake people make when something stops working. Most of them think the answer is more force, more wood, bigger flames, more effort. They believe failure means they have not pushed hard enough. Sometimes that is true, but sometimes the wiser answer is smaller, calmer, and smarter. Elias Morin did not defeat a Montana winter with a bigger fire. He changed the way the heat moved. He made one small flame do the work of many. And in that frozen valley, while other men fed roaring fireplaces that could not hold back the cold, he showed that the right path can matter more than raw strength. Sometimes the quietest fire, in the right hands, can carry a whole family through the storm. If you believe stories still matter, go ahead and hit subscribe Stories Beyond the Porch. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Thanks for watching.